day after we buried my mother, I knelt on the floor of her bedroom with 11 envelopes in my lap, and not one of them had ever been opened. They were addressed to me. Every single one. My name in her handwriting, that careful, forward-leaning hand she used for thank you notes and for the tags on Christmas presents, the hand I would have known in a room full of strangers. And under my name, an address, a street I had not lived on since the spring of 1991, and stamped across the front of each envelope, in red, slightly crooked, the same 2 words: Return to sender. I am going to tell you what was inside those envelopes. I promise you that. But if I start there, it will only sound like a sad thing that happened, and it is so much more than that. Because those 11 envelopes did not simply tell me something I had not known. They took 34 years of my life, 34 years I was certain I understood, and they turned the whole of it over like a stone and showed me what had been living underneath the entire time. My name is Eleanor. I taught 2nd grade in a small town in Vermont for 31 years, which means I have spent most of my life being patient and being certain at the very same time. And I can tell you now that those 2 things together are far more dangerous than people think. I am 58 years old, and for nearly all of my adult life, I believed something about my mother the way you believe the next stair will be there when your foot comes down. I believed that she loved my younger sister more than she loved me. I want to tell you how I came to believe it, and then I want to tell you honestly how wrong I was. Let me give you my mother first, because you cannot understand any of this without her. Her name was Ruth. She was a small, upright woman who ironed pillowcases and who never once in my life let me see her cry. For 26 years, she directed the choir at the Methodist Church on Cottage Street, and she carried the particular dignity of a woman who has stood in front of other people and kept time for them. She believed in doing things correctly. She believed that feelings were real, but private, the way the inside of a house is real, but you do not show it to people passing on the road. My father was a quieter version of the same idea. He sold farm insurance. He was kind in small, steady ways, and he died when I was 26, of a heart that simply stopped one Tuesday afternoon in the driveway. I was already gone by then. I had left. That word matters, so let me be careful with it. I left. I went to college 4 hours south, the first in my family ever to do it. Then I took a teaching job 2 states over, and I married a man named Daniel, and I built my life there. My sister Margaret, who is 3 years younger than me, did the opposite of all of it. She stayed. She married a man from one town over, she bought a house 11 minutes from our mother's front door, and she raised her children in the same streets where the 2 of us had been children. And here is the thing I want you to sit with, because I sat with it for 3 decades. After our father died, my mother began, slowly, to disappear from my life. Not all at once. There was no fight. There was no door slammed in anyone's face. It was more like watching the tide go out when you are not looking directly at it. You glance up, and the water is simply further away than it was, and you cannot say when it moved. The first thing I lost was my college graduation. She did not come. I had a cap and a gown and a folding chair on a hot lawn, and I had told her the date 3 separate times, and the seat I had saved for her stayed empty the whole long afternoon. Afterward, on the telephone, she said only that she had not been able to get away. That was all. She had not been able to get away. And Margaret, who was 19 then and still at home, told me later, in the gentle, careless way of younger sisters, that Mom had spent that entire weekend out in the garden. I want to be fair to the young woman I was, standing on that lawn in a borrowed gown, scanning a crowd for a small, upright figure who never came. She was not wrong to be hurt. The hurt was real, and the seat was empty, and those are facts. What she did with the hurt afterward is a different matter, and I will get to it. After that, the tide just kept going out. When my son was born, she sent a card and a knitted blanket, but she did not come, not for weeks. And when she finally did come, she stayed 2 nights and seemed, the whole time, like a guest who was quietly counting the hours until she could leave. The phone calls got shorter. They got stranger. I would call on a Sunday, and she would answer my questions slightly wrong, as if she were answering a different question, one I had not actually asked. I would say, "How is your knee?" And she would tell me about the weather. I would say it again, and she would go quiet, and then she would say, "Well, you know," and change the subject entirely. And every single time I hung up that telephone, I had the same thought. And by then, the thought had a shape to it, worn smooth as a river stone from all the handling. The thought was, she does not really want to talk to me. The thought was, she is saving herself for Margaret. Because Margaret was right there. Margaret took her to the eye doctor and the foot doctor. Margaret's children ran shrieking through her kitchen on a Saturday. Margaret called her every day of the week. And from where I stood, 4 hours and then 2 states away, it looked exactly like the thing I had decided it was. It looked like my mother had been given 2 daughters and had quietly, without ever once saying the words out loud, chosen one of them. I had a theory about my mother. I held it for 30 years. And a theory you carry for 30 years and never once test against the truth does not stay a theory. It hardens. It becomes a wall, and you build the rest of the house against that wall. And after enough time, you can no longer remember that the wall is a thing you put up yourself. You think it is simply where the world ends. So I did what hurt people do when they have decided they are not wanted. I stopped reaching. I told myself I was being mature about it. I told myself I was respecting her, giving her the distance she so plainly preferred. I sent cards. I called on the holidays that required a call. I was, I thought, being very dignified, and it would be another 30 years before I understood that my dignity and her dignity were the same illness, and that the two of us had been quietly dying of it in separate houses the entire time. I am going to tell you about the drawer now, but I need you to remember one thing as I do. I need you to remember that I was, by trade, a person who was supposed to be good at exactly this. I spent 31 years in a classroom learning how to read the child who has gone quiet. I knew, professionally, in my bones, that the boy who will not look at you is not always the boy who does not care. Sometimes, he is the boy who is ashamed of something he cannot find the words to say. I knew that. I taught it to younger teachers, and I never once thought to turn it toward my own mother. My mother's last years belonged to Margaret. I want to say that plainly because it is true, and because it was the very heart of my resentment, and I cannot tell you this story honestly if I pretend otherwise. Margaret drove her to the appointments. Margaret sat in the waiting rooms with the old magazines. Margaret learned which pill was which. When our mother could no longer manage the stairs in the Cottage Street house, it was Margaret who found the man to put the rail in, Margaret who argued with her about needing it, and Margaret who won. And I, 2 states away, told myself a story about that too. I told myself that Margaret finally had what she had wanted all along, that she had our mother to herself at last. I am not proud of that. I am telling you because somewhere out there is a person listening to me right now who is doing the very same arithmetic about their own family and arriving at the very same wrong answer. And I would like, if I possibly can, to reach them before the stone over the grave makes that answer permanent. The last time I saw my mother truly herself was a Thanksgiving, 6 years before she died. I drove up for it. I sat at the table I had grown up at, and my mother, directly across from me, was somewhere I could not seem to reach. I would speak to her, and she would look at Margaret instead of at me, with a kind of question in her face, and Margaret would lean in and say it again, lower and slower, and only then would my mother answer me. She did this all afternoon long. She turned to my sister in order to understand her own daughter. I drove home that night certain, completely certain, that I had just watched a woman who could not be troubled to listen to her own first child. I had watched her choose, in real time, right in front of me, who in that kitchen was worth the effort. That is what I saw. And I want you to hold on to what I actually saw with my own eyes, because I was about to learn that I had been looking straight at the truth for years, and reading it, every time, perfectly backward. She died on a Thursday in April, in her sleep, which is the death we are all supposed to want for the people we love. Margaret called me. My sister's voice on the telephone was the voice of a woman who has been doing a long, hard job for years, and has just been told the job is over. And I, God forgive me, heard even that as an accusation aimed at me. I drove up for the funeral. I stood in the Methodist church on Cottage Street, directly under the choir loft my mother had run for 26 years, and I sang the hymns, and Margaret and I stood 3 feet apart from one another and did not touch. There is a particular grief that belongs to people who are estranged from someone, and then that someone dies. It is not a clean grief. It does not get to be clean. You are grieving the person, and then underneath that, you are also grieving the conversation, the one you were always, secretly, sure you would get to have one day. The conversation where it all finally came clear. And the death does not only take the person, it takes that conversation too. It locks the door on it forever. That was the grief I carried into my mother's empty house the next morning, and I did not yet know that she had left the conversation for me anyway, in a drawer, with a key. We cleared the house the way sisters do, which is to say, badly, and in near silence, and in separate rooms. Margaret took the kitchen, because the kitchen was hers. It had always been hers. She gave me the bedroom. I have thought since that she gave me the bedroom because it was the hardest room in the house, and she had already done so very many hard things, and this one she could finally hand to somebody else. It was a small room, a bed my mother had made every single morning of her life, made even on the last one, a closet of dresses that still held the smell of her, and a bureau by the window, 4 drawers, and the bottom drawer was locked. I want to tell you that I felt something the moment I saw that it was locked. I did not. I was tired and my back ached, and I thought mostly that this was simply one more obstacle in a day that was made entirely of obstacles. I called for Margaret. She came and stood in the doorway and looked at the drawer, and then she went away and came back with a small brass key from a dish on the kitchen windowsill. A key, she said, that had sat in that dish for as long as she could remember, and not one of us had ever known what it opened. She handed it to me. She handed it to me the way you hand a person a key, which is to say like it was nothing at all. And then she went back to the kitchen, and I knelt down on the floor of my mother's bedroom, and I fit the key into the lock. And neither of us knew that I was about to open the last 34 years and find them full of something entirely other than what the 2 of us had put there. The drawer did not stick. It slid open easily, the way a drawer slides when it has been opened and closed with care, over and over for a long time. And inside it were letters. Envelopes. A stack of them, held together with a single loop of pale string, the kind of string my mother used for wrapping parcels. I lifted the bundle out, and it was heavier than I expected it to be, the way a thing is always heavier when it is going to matter. I slid the string off. I spread them out on the floor in the light from the window. There were 11 of them. They were all addressed to me. I knew my own name, and I knew her hand, and the 2 of them together, over and over, 11 separate times, made a sound in my head like a single held note that would not stop. And every envelope was addressed to the same place, 41 Brewer Street, Apartment 2. The apartment I had rented for 2 years straight out of college. The apartment I had moved out of in the spring of 1991, when I was 24 years old, and the whole of my real life was still in front of me. And across the front of every one of them, in the red ink of a post office stamp, crooked, sometimes printed twice, were the words, "Return to sender." My mother had written to me. For years. And she had sent every letter to an address I had not lived at in more than 3 decades. So every letter had traveled out and then traveled back. And she had taken each one out of her mailbox when it returned to her, and she had not thrown a single one of them away. She had put them in a drawer, and she had locked the drawer. I sat down on the floor, and I opened the oldest one. I could tell which was oldest because its postmark was the faintest, and the paper inside was the softest, worn thin along the folds from how many times, I would only understand later, she had taken it out and read it through herself. I am not going to read you the whole of that letter. Some things are not for a video, even a video I am telling to you like this one. But I will tell you what it said, because what it said is the entire reason I am sitting here speaking to you now. My mother wrote that she was losing her hearing, that she had been losing it for years, slowly, the high sounds going first and then the rest of them, and that she had not told a single soul how bad it had truly become, because she could not bear to. She wrote that the telephone had become a kind of torture to her, that when I called, She could catch perhaps half of what I said, and she would quietly guess at the other half, and she could hear in my voice the exact moment when she had guessed wrong. A little pause, a little patience, and that patience, she wrote, was far worse to her than anger would ever have been. She wrote one sentence in that letter that I now have by heart, and will have by heart until the day I die. She wrote, "I would rather you thought I was cold than have you hear me become stupid." That is why she stopped calling me. Not because she did not want my voice, because she could not bear what her own deafness was doing to my voice, the way it turned every ordinary Sunday phone call into a small public examination that she sat and failed again and again. So she decided, in the way that proud people decide terrible things, quietly and entirely alone, that she would write to me instead. Letters. Letters she could take her time over. Letters where she could not mishear me, and where I could not hear her fumble and reach and come up short. And then she sent those letters to Brewer Street, to the apartment I had left in 1991. There was more in that first letter still. She wrote about my graduation, the graduation she had not come to, the empty folding chair, the 30-year wound, and she wrote that she had come, that she had driven the 4 hours and had gotten the time of the ceremony wrong, a full hour wrong, and had arrived as it was ending, that she had stood at the very back of that hot, crowded lawn and watched the gowns come down off the stage and could not find me anywhere in the crowd of them, and that she had been so ashamed, so completely certain that she had ruined the single proudest day of my life, that she had simply gotten back into her car and driven 4 hours home again without ever telling me she had been there at all, and had let me believe, for the 30 years that followed, that she had not bothered to come. I knelt there on my mother's bedroom floor, and I understood, all at once and far, far too late, that I had spent the whole of my adult life furious at a woman for a coldness that had never once been coldness. It was shame. It had been shame the entire time, and shame, seen from the outside, in the wrong light, looks so precisely like not being loved that a person can build an entire life upon the mistake. I had built mine. I read all 11 of them that night. I had not meant to. I had meant to read 2, perhaps 3, and then sleep, and finish the rest in the morning, the way you ration something that you already know is going to hurt you. But you cannot ration this. I sat on the floor with my back against my mother's bed, and I read them in their order, oldest to newest, and the window went from gold to gray to full black, and somewhere in the middle of it, Margaret drove home, and I did not even hear her car leave. The letters were not dramatic. I think that is the part that undid me most completely. They were not the wild confessions of a woman tearing her own heart out onto the page. They were small. They were a mother telling her daughter the plain, ordinary news of a plain, ordinary life, in the only way she had left to tell it. She wrote about her tomatoes. She wrote about a hymn the new choir director had chosen, that she did not believe suited the room. She wrote that she had seen a cardinal land on the porch rail and had thought of me, because I had loved them so as a girl, and she wondered whether I had ever told my own children the old idea that a cardinal means someone is visiting, and she asked about my children. By their names. In every single letter, by their names. She knew that my son had switched from the trumpet to the trombone. She knew that my daughter had a particular way of reading at the dinner table that needed watching. She had been listening, you understand. She had been listening the entire time, through Margaret, gathering up every small fact of my life that managed to reach her second hand, and then writing them all gently back to me, at an address where I would never, ever read a word of it. In the 6th letter, she wrote the thing that I have had the hardest time forgiving, and also the hardest time not forgiving, because the two are tangled together, and I do not believe they will ever fully come apart. She wrote that she knew Margaret believed I had abandoned them, that my sister thought I was cold, that I had left and never once looked back, that I had let her carry our mother entirely alone out of pure selfishness. And my mother wrote that she had never corrected her, that she had let Margaret go on believing every word of it, because to correct it, you see, to explain to Margaret why her sister had truly gone so quiet, she would have had to explain the deafness, and the shame, and the returned letters, and the whole vast architecture of the hiding. And she could not. She could not say any of it out loud to the daughter standing right there in her kitchen, any more than she could say it down a telephone line. So, she let it stand. She let Margaret think that I was cold, and she let me think that I was unwanted. And the two of us, her two daughters, drifted apart across 30 years on a thing that had never once been true. And our mother watched the both of us do it, and could not find the courage anywhere inside herself to say the one plain sentence that would have stopped it. That is not a villain. I want to be very clear about that, because it would honestly be easier for me if it were. It is not a villain. It is a frightened, proud, deaf old woman who made herself smaller and smaller and smaller to keep anyone from watching her shrink until the shame had cost her both of her children, and even then she still could not bring herself to set it down. The 11th letter was different from all the others. It was the only one with no red stamp across the front of it. She had never mailed it. She had written it and folded it and placed it in the drawer with all the rest, and had never even carried it to the post office to make its useless journey out to Brewer Street and back. It was short. Her hand was not as steady in it as it had been in the early ones. She wrote that she no longer knew if she would ever manage to send these, or to fix them, or to explain them to me. And she wrote that if I ever did read them, she hoped that I would believe one single thing above all the others. And the thing was this, that the distance between us had never, not for one day, been a choice. That she had loved me from too far away for far too long, and that the too far away had been a place she built in order to hide herself, and never, ever a thing she built in order to keep me out. She wrote, in the very last line of it, that she hoped my life was good and full and loud, and that she was sorry. Sorry that she had made her silence look like a verdict. And then she signed it the way she had signed every one of them. Not love, Mom. She signed it, your mother, Ruth, as though, even after all of it, she was still not entirely certain that she had the right to the other word. It was past 2 o'clock in the morning when I finished the last one. And then I did a thing I had not done in more years than I can rightly tell you. I picked up the telephone. My mother's telephone, the very instrument that had done so much of this damage. And I called my sister. Margaret answered on the second ring, the way a person answers at 2 in the morning, already afraid of what they are about to hear. I said to her, "It is not an emergency, nobody is hurt." And then I said, "I need you to come back to the house. There is something here that you have to see, and I cannot be the only person left alive who has seen it." She came in her winter coat pulled on over her night clothes. I had the letters spread across the kitchen table, our mother's kitchen table, under the overhead light, and I sat my sister down, and I handed her the first one, the oldest, and I watched her face do, in the space of a single page, the exact thing my own face had done some hours before. I watched 30 years rearrange themselves, quietly, behind her eyes. We did not fall into one another's arms. I want to tell you the truth, and the truth is that we did not. We sat at that table until the sky outside went gray, and we said hard things to each other, the hard things that each of us had been saving up for 3 decades. Margaret said that she had spent the whole of her adult life furious that I had left her holding all of it alone. That every appointment, every fall, every long, bad afternoon, she had carried it knowing she had a sister 2 states away who, she believed, simply could not be troubled to help. And I told her that I had spent those very same 30 years certain that our mother had handed me over to her like a thing she was finished with. And the two of us looked at each other across all those letters, and we understood, at last, that we had both been told a story. The same story, by the same gentle, frightened woman, and that not once, in 30 years, had either of us thought to turn to the other and simply ask whether her half of it was true. People want to know, when I tell this, whether Margaret and I are close now. I understand the wanting. We have all of us had quite enough of stories that end in the dark. But I am not going to lie to you in order to make you feel better, because the truth is the more useful thing, and the truth is this. 30 years do not dissolve in one night at a kitchen table. They do not. The morning after, my sister and I were still 2 women who had spent the best decades of their lives as strangers to each other, and you cannot simply embrace that away. What changed was not the 30 years. What changed was the direction we were facing. For the first time since the two of us were girls, my sister and I were facing the same way. We talk now. On Sundays, on the telephone, both of us still a little careful, a little formal, the way you are careful with a thing that broke once and has been mended, and you are still quietly learning how much weight it will take. She has been down to visit me twice. I have learned things about her marriage and about her worries that I had no idea of, because for 30 years I never once believed I was allowed to know them. It is not the closeness that the two of us would have had. That closeness is gone. It went where the years went. But what we have built in its place is real, and it is ours, and we made it ourselves out of the wreck. And I have come to believe that a thing you build late, out of the wreck, is not a lesser thing. It is only a different thing. It is late, but it is not nothing. And there is one more thing that I did, and I am going to tell you about it, even though it is the part that sounds the strangest, because it is also the part that healed the most. I answered the letters, all 11 of them. I sat down in that first long month afterward, and I wrote my mother 11 letters back, one for each of hers, and I answered the actual things that she had said to me. I told her that the trombone had turned out to be a good decision. I told her that, yes, I had told my children the old idea about the cardinals, that someone is visiting. I told her that I had never been a daughter who needed her to be perfect on the telephone, that I would have taken her slow, and I would have taken her wrong, that I would have taken her deaf and laughing at her own deafness, if only she had once let me see her be it. I told her that I forgave her. And then I told her the harder thing, which was that I needed her to forgive me, because she at least had been frightened and hiding, and even so she had kept on writing. And I, who had no excuse at all, none, had simply gone quiet, and then called my silence dignity. I will never send those letters. There is nowhere on this earth to send them, and I knew that with every single word I wrote. But I learned something in the writing of them that I had not known before, something that this whole long story had been trying to teach me. And it is that a letter is not only ever for the person whose name is on the front of it. Sometimes a letter is the only room left in the world where you can finally stand and say the thing out loud. And saying it, even in that room, even to no one, still counts. It counts for the one who is left behind to say it. I keep my mother's 11 letters in a wooden box now, and my own 11 lie beside them, and I do not take them out very often, but I always know that they are there, and the knowing of it has changed the very shape of my grief. My grief used to be a closed door. Now it is a room that I can walk into. That is a great deal, where grief is concerned. That is very nearly everything. I have thought a long while about how all of it came to happen, how a family of people who genuinely, deeply loved one another managed to spend 30 years entirely convinced of the precise opposite. And I have decided, finally, that it was not cruelty that did it. There was no cruelty anywhere in this whole story. What did it was quiet. It was 3 proud people, my mother and my sister and me, each one of us so completely certain that our own silence was a form of strength, a way of not being a burden to anyone, a way of being dignified. And all 3 of our silences, laid together, built a house that not one of us could hear another living soul inside of. I taught small children for 31 years. I told you that at the very start of this. And the one thing I would go back now and teach myself, the young teacher and the young daughter, both of them at once, is this. The person who has gone quiet on you is almost never telling you that they do not care. Far, far more often, they are telling you that there is something they are too ashamed to let you see. And the only thing that has ever once worked against that kind of silence is for somebody to be brave enough and humble enough to knock anyway. To knock upon the door you are most certain has been locked against you, because sometimes it was never locked against you at all. Sometimes there is only a frightened person standing on the other side of it, holding a stack of letters, hoping past all hope that they hear a knock. If this story landed for you, drop the word unsent in the comments below. I read them. It tells me which stories are worth telling next. Subscribe for new stories, real patterns, full narratives, The long game. Two small pieces of wisdom from this one before I go. The first is this. When someone you love goes distant from you, before you decide what their distance means, go and ask them. Do not interpret it. Do not let it harden inside of you for 30 years the way that I let mine. A question costs you only one small moment of your pride. A wrong assumption can cost you an entire person. They are not the same price. I paid the larger one, all of it, so that perhaps you will not have to. And the second, if there is something you have been meaning to say to someone, an apology, a forgiveness, a plain and ordinary I love you that has gone unspoken for far too long, do not wait until you have found the perfect words for it. My mother waited for the perfect words. She waited for a way to say it that would not show anyone her shame, and the words never did come perfect enough, and so the letter sat in a locked drawer and the years quietly ran out. The clumsy thing that is said today is worth more, infinitely more, than the perfect thing that is said never. Whatever you've been meaning to say it while the saying still counts. I'll see you next time.